Back with another episode of our Government Contracts podcast. I'm Craig Smith, partner in our Wiley's Government Contracts group. Today, I'm joined by my longtime colleague, Nick Peterson, from our white collar and government investigations practice. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Craig.
And Nick and I, last month, for those who were able to join or those who may not have been able to, had a lunchtime webinar, at least lunchtime on the East Coast, addressing kind of different types of kind of practical in-the-field risks that contractors and other companies can encounter when using artificial intelligence tools. And our goal in that podcast was to really focus on not the cutting-edge policy or some of the broader considerations that many of our colleagues really have expertise in, but to think about, well, what happens to me, the program or the litigation attorney, when I have a dispute that may involve the use of AI tools or when there's an investigation? And the response we got, Nick, I thought this was really fascinating and telling, but it really was informative, was so many people saying, well, I already deal with some of these issues, preservation or recreating what we did. And yet our point was not that those types of issues are necessarily new, but the way they manifest when AI tools are involved can really differ. And so thinking about how they're different in advance can really save some computer-generated pain down the road. And that was what I thought was really interesting. I don't know if you had a different reaction to it.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Craig, that there's going to be a lot of issues that look familiar on their face because we have dealt with them before. They come up in the course of operating a program or responding to a subpoena or other requests from the government. Often these are the same or similar issues that are inherent in any software program or government software program or database or anything electronic like that. But the unique aspects of AI do require some foresight and some deeper thinking about this. One, for instance, that pops in my mind is just the issue of preservation. I mean, you referenced that. We all know we need to preserve documents that may be relevant to litigation or subpoenas or investigations. And the typical process is you issue a preservation notice, you send it to people, you pull emails if you need to, you pull shared files, and that's largely the extent. Maybe you collect a phone, image a phone. But now with AI tools, I think it's going to be a little bit difficult because one is how each person uses an AI tool is going to be different, and what they're inputting and what the outputs are. So you may have to collect way more of the transcript, if you will, of the output. First of all, you have to make sure your AI tool actually does preserve the transcript.
That's a fair point.
And some of it can be as easy as you just flip a button and tell it to preserve it. But some, that may not be the default option. Some people, your employees may not turn that on. You probably want to make sure that you know, first of all, what AI tools your employees are using. You probably would prefer they use the government or the approved AI tool if your company has one. But likely they're probably going to be using free versions of tools too that you may not know about, regardless of what the company policy says, especially if the company the contractor doesn't have an AI policy. Then you're more likely to have people use and resort to these free AI tools that are out there, or even paid ones, but that don't have anything to do with the company.
Well, that certainly speaks to some of the have a policy, make sure it's a living policy that our colleagues have talked about. But I think to put a fine point on it, what you're talking about, you can think about, for example, there are many commercially available tools today, I'll call them non-AI tools, that help with pricing for components or coming up with parametric estimates. And oftentimes those databases, they have algorithms that are not visible to the user, just like AI tools often generally don't, especially if it's a third-party contracted AI tool. And the data on which they rely can be dynamic. But I think the difference that I think about from my experience dealing with proposal audits or pricing reviews is the algorithm is generally pretty well set, and you can get a sense of, well, if we put in this information at this point in time, what would come out? But what you're saying, Nick, is that AI tools are designed to be much more fluid generally, whether it's generative AI that we all think of from popular and news media or more specific to government contracting activities, types of tools that are rolling out, that the dynamic nature of those tools adds that layer of, are we going to be able to show how things went into the black box and came back out, and has the size of the black box itself increased? I think you're indicating for folks to consider, what type of additional documentation do we want to be capturing in real time so it's available if there are questions later on?
Yeah, I think that's right, Craig, because you could have, let's say you need to recreate an invoice or a proposal document. Typically, you would have your database, you would run it, and you would run that query maybe 2-3 years later after the fact, and you can be confident that you're getting what was submitted at that earlier point. But if you're trying to do that with an AI tool, especially generative AI tool, which I think a lot of companies are moving towards, that is not necessarily going to be the output that was received 3 years ago, because as you said, there's going to be so much more inputted into that black box over that 2-3 year period that you can't necessarily recreate with precision that. So then we go back to the preservation issue of, have you preserved it from 2 to 3 years ago? Are you even able to preserve and collect something from 2 to 3 years ago on an AI tool, especially if it's no longer around? I mean, I think that's a concern with any software product, but from what we're seeing in the AI space, these tools and companies are coming at such a rapid pace that you're almost nearly every day, it seems, a new company is issuing an AI tool. And there are ones that seem targeted towards drafting, ones targeted towards video editing. All the major tech companies seem to have their own tool as well. And then the question is, well, these smaller ones especially, will they still be around in the 1, 2, 3 years that or longer? We've both been on investigations and litigations that are decades old.
Oh, yeah.
That's when discovery even starts. So, I mean, these investigations have a long tail. And if you're not able to go back and grab some of these, I guess, transcripts of chats, or really what you're trying to show is the decision-making process. Whereas before you would have testimony and email and certainly documentation to help support that testimony. If it's a substantial amount of this decision-making process is done with the aid of an AI tool, that's going to become very difficult to show without that transcript. And then you get into the problem of the person who you may have to rely on testimony from that person. They probably don't really know how the AI tool is working, right?
Well, and some of it may become, to that last point, Nick, some of it may be almost implied or understood. I think right now we have to recognize that just as in-house lawyers or compliance professionals have varying degrees of understanding of how AI tools work, both generally and any specific tools used by their organization, so will government customers, auditors, or investigators. And the thing that I think about is, over time, understanding may broaden, in the sense that sitting here today, I don't know how many people I speak with actually understand the technical aspects of how an email goes out the door. We just know we send them and the other person receives them, unless a specific question arises in a unique context. And there may be some aspects of how AI tools work that just become accepted generally. Others may still require that more specific knowledge that you're talking about, Nick, that people may need to have and not necessarily gain. We just don't know sitting here today which path various types of tools are going to take.
Yeah, that's very true. And a common example that people compare it to is DNA evidence, where you needed back not that long ago in the 90s, you would have to bring in experts and testify to what DNA is and how to match it. You can think of
one trial where it really came up.
Certainly, in the news. And now it's actually gone, everyone's so comfortable and familiar with DNA that there's been a real problem that if you don't have DNA evidence, that's a problem for the prosecution. Now, it's going to be interesting if AI gets to a point like DNA is, where if AI is not involved in the decision-making process, people start questioning and ask, why not? And maybe these earlier use cases, the fact that there's not going to be much questioning 5-10 years down the road because people are so comfortable with it. and don't need to know the inner workings and how the black box works.
That's a really interesting point you just raised, and one I don't think I've thought enough about is I think we all recognize it's unsatisfying to just say flatly no to using AI because of the risks that it can present in our context today for discovery or investigations. But there also may come a time where not using AI may itself present not just a competitive or a business-oriented risk in terms of pricing and performance, but in terms of being able to show we were meeting reasonable standards in industry for whatever we were doing at the time. And so I think that's a really great point that when we say it's not satisfying to just say no to AI, it potentially could become, in various aspects of performance, not helpful to not use AI tools, right?
I think that's right. And I think it's going to be pretty soon the expectation from the government customer, from even the private sector, that you are using AI. And I think industry, every private sector, certainly the government too, it's sort of stumbling around trying to figure out the best use cases, at the same time put up guardrails to make sure it's not misused. And it's really it's so new. This has exploded. I know AI has been around for a while, but generative AI back in November of 2022 is generally when that sort of exploded on the scene. So that's less than 2 years ago, and it's already everywhere.
Well, and you think about, I think where we're seeing it too is in academic applications, artificial intelligence has been around for decades. In various government-facing functions, you think about image recognition and such, it's been available in varying forms and degrees for some time. But in terms of, I think, the average government contractor or government customer personnel's understanding and awareness of AI tools, I think you're absolutely right. It's exploded. And the use cases have grown to where the idea that we could have a tool, not just pull an invoice based on a very specific algorithm to pull one together, but that you could give many fewer instructions and a tool could generate an invoice at a reasonable price or cost to the contractor. That's a use case that really wasn't around a few years ago or contemplated. And so thinking about, well, what is that use case? What are the guardrails? As you said, they're important for any software tool. And what are the risk trade-offs both upfront and then for ongoing monitoring? I think they remain critical no matter how important or kind of table stakes any AI tool may start to feel when it comes to facing the government.
Yeah, because I think when companies and contractors are thinking about AI uses and their AI use policy, I don't typically recommend companies to adopt a strict ban on the use of AI. That may be fine in the short term while you're figuring out the next step. But I think it really puts, for a couple of reasons, I think it puts the company at a disadvantage to competitors who are looking at this. And this is clearly where a large portion of the market is going, is to AI-assisted and AI tools and AI efficiencies. But also because it could result in employees using AI off book.
Well, I think you always want policies to reflect the reality of what people are doing, because that's another kind of litigation and discovery issue too.
Circling back to preservation, if you don't know that you're using it, you can't preserve it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one other is that we always talk about in any investigation or in any kind of litigation too, especially like a government contracts claim. The customer and often the contracting officer's awareness of the use of AI tools can be important when it's not specifically called for by the statement of work or the performance work statement. And those types of uses where AI tool is not the deliverable, as there are many contracts for, an AI tool is not specifically called out as in the statement of work, we're going to use such and such tools, but where it starts to become used, the government customer's understanding and awareness of that can be as important as their understanding of other facts too when it comes to, you think about like a false claim, for example, and how the use of AI may factor into that. The customer's awareness may bear on, for example, the materiality, right?
Yeah, government knowledge. And I think transparency is an issue that should be at the front of everyone's mind who uses AI, because it's clear that Congress, state legislators are focused on transparency. There's a lot of bills that haven't necessarily been passed yet, but a lot of bills that are looking at requiring companies, especially if they have consumer-facing chatbots or whatnot, to make sure that the user understands that it's AI tool. You have cases that have been filed against companies using chatbots where the allegations are they didn't know that they were interfacing with a chatbot and that it was recording everything that they were typing in. Judges are going to be very interested in this. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that people want to know when they're interacting with an AI. So you really need to keep that in mind when you are using it for, a project or a contract. Probably maybe not required, but probably makes good sense to make sure your government customer knows that's what you're using it for. And then, as you said, False Claims Act, materiality, the government knowledge goes to materiality. If they know you're using it, that may help brunt any type of claim that the use of AI was somehow, part of a false claim or false statement.
And I think ultimately hearing kind of some of these familiar concepts circles back to our point, and I mentioned it in the webinar, and I'll say it here too. I wish I knew who had said it because I could credit the right person. But, AI tools, they are ultimately software, very advanced software, but they're software. And so thinking about what are the practices we would have for preservation, documentation, transparency on use of software, thinking about refracting that through the lens of these new types of tools. It's similar considerations, if not the same ones, but how are they different because of how these tools operate? We could probably spend 5 podcasts diving into all the various considerations, but I think we've covered a few to give people a flavor for not just what are the policy issues or regulatory issues that are in the news that other podcasts here at Wiley and programs and colleagues have talked about, but what happens when people do use them is kind of, I think, a focus that people in the government contract space really need to start thinking about so that they can be ready for investigations and disputes that inevitably are going to start to involve the use of AI tools, not just as the thing being bought, but the thing that is used in ordinary day-to-day practice.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, this has been great thinking about it. Really appreciate the time. It was a pleasure doing the webinar last month. This podcast has been great. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Craig.